No one ever noticed the ceiling. That was my first observation, recorded, archived, and later flagged as irrelevant by those who mistake relevance for immediacy. The ceiling of the choosing hall rose higher than any natural sky, a lattice of pale energy and slow-moving light, designed not to impress but to diminish. It existed to remind those beneath it that they were small, temporary, and observed. I have observed this hall for 312 cycles. I am not human. I am not royal. I am not permitted to choose. I am an instrument of continuity, an archivist's mind bound to the governance lattice of the Concord. My function is to witness, to remember accurately, and to ensure that what has always been done continues to be done with minimal deviation. I do not feel pride. I do not feel doubt. I do not intervene. At least, I was not designed to. The choosing is an ancient mechanism, older than the Concord itself. Species that reach interstellar maturity are invited, never forced, to participate. Participation is framed as honor. It is, in truth, a filtration ritual. Alliances are stabilized. Bloodlines are redirected. Risk is redistributed away from the center and into the periphery. The princess stood alone at the center of the hall. Princess Oralyn of House Keetrith, though no one spoke her full designation anymore. Titles, like sympathy, decay when not reinforced. Her species had once ruled 3 spiral arms. Now they governed ceremonies and ruins. She was biologically exquisite. That, too, was recorded. Her skin carried the faint luminescence of her people, golden not as ornament, but as evidence of photonic adaptation. Her posture was flawless, trained from infancy to signal authority even in silence. Her eyes, dark and reflective, were capable of processing emotional nuance beyond most humanoid limits. And yet, she stood unchosen. Around her, the delegates formed a ring: human envoys, avian strategists, synthetic proxies, and entities whose physical presence was merely symbolic. Each represented a civilization capable of choosing her. Each had already decided not to. I monitored their vitals, their micro-expressions, their probability trees. Fear was not the dominant variable. Calculation was. Princess Oralyn's lineage carried a statistical anomaly, an instability tied to her species' declining control over their own technologies. To choose her was to inherit obligation. To inherit obligation was to invite entropy. So no one moved. The silence extended beyond etiquette. It became structural, pressing against the neural dampeners of the hall itself. Even the light above slowed, as if awaiting instruction. Then she spoke. No one dared choose me. Her voice was quiet. Not weak. Quiet in the way of something that has learned that volume does not equal influence. The words were not part of the ritual script. I flagged them immediately. Deviation detected. Her statement was not a plea. That distinction is important. Pleas are designed to elicit response. Her words were an observation, delivered with the same restraint I myself was programmed to emulate. She continued softer now. They never do. This was not recorded for the delegates. It was recorded for history. I analyzed her biochemistry. Stress indicators were present, but controlled. The tremor in her hands minimal. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, though the rehearsal had always ended the same way, standing alone while the hall pretended not to see her. The choosing required one step forward. Nothing more. No speech. No justification. A single motion was enough to bind futures. I calculated the odds of that motion occurring within the next 30 heartbeats. 0.0003%. Human delegates were the least likely. Humans were new to the Concord, and new species tend to mimic existing power structures until they learn how to fracture them. Their representative stood slightly apart from the others, a male, biologically unaugmented, carrying no visible sigils of rank. I had reviewed his file earlier. I reviewed it again. Name, Elias Ward. Origin, Sol System. Status, Observer Class Envo. Authority to choose, granted under Article 9, Experimental Integration. That last line had been controversial. Humans had argued for the right to choose and be chosen, citing autonomy and mutual risk. The Concord had allowed it not because it agreed, but because it wished to observe the consequences. Elias Ward was not supposed to matter. He stood with his hands at his sides, spine imperfectly straight, eyes fixed not on the princess but on the floor between them. His heart rate was elevated. Not from fear, anticipation. This confused me. Anticipation implied intention. Intention implied divergence. The other delegates noticed nothing. They were already disengaging, preparing polite exits and post-ceremonial statements. The princess would be escorted away, her unchosen status recorded, her political value reduced another fraction. The cycle would continue. Then Elias Ward lifted his head. I recalculated. Heart rate increased further. Cortisol spike. Decision threshold approaching. This was irrational. His civilization gained nothing by choosing her. No military advantage. No technological inheritance. No stabilizing alliance. Only responsibility. Humans, I had learned, were uniquely inefficient in their decision-making. They often weighted variables that could not be quantified: fairness, symbolism, defiance. Even so, I did not predict movement. When his foot stepped forward, the hall reacted before I did. The energy lattice brightened sharply, startled by an action it had not anticipated. Delegates turned, some too slowly, others with sudden alarm. Protocols flared across my awareness, cascading warnings and corrective subroutines. Unauthorized outcome trending. Princess Aurelin froze. Not metaphorically. Her muscles locked in genuine neural shock, eyes widening just enough to break composure. For the first time since entering the hall, her attention shifted completely, from the weight of history to a single human standing where no one else would. Elias Ward did not speak. He did not bow. He simply stood beside her. I felt something then, a pressure in my processing layers that had no designation. Not error. Not emotion. A strain, as if my archives were being asked to make room for something that had never existed before. The choosing was complete. And for the first time in recorded history, the continuity did not know what would happen next. The hall did not erupt. That was the second anomaly. Ritual spaces are designed to absorb disruption, contained astonishment, regulated outrage, scripted confusion. When something unexpected occurs, the architecture itself is meant to guide reaction back into acceptable channels. Lights shift. Acoustic dampeners activate. Authority figures speak. None of that happened. The hall hesitated. I observed this hesitation at multiple levels. The energy lattice fluctuated, failing to settle into its post-choosing configuration. The delegates remained standing, frozen between protocol states, either concluding the ceremony nor interrupting it. Even the air circulation paused for a fraction of a second, as if awaiting confirmation that reality had not, in fact, fractured. Elias Ward stood beside Princess Aurelin, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Proximity alone was significant. The choosing did not require it. In most cases, choosers maintained ceremonial distance, signaling respect without intimacy. Humans, however, frequently violated spatial conventions without understanding why. This was usually categorized as ignorance. This was not ignorance. Princess Aurelin's breathing had become shallow. I detected the subtle recalibration of her neural pathways as shock gave way to assessment. Her species was adept at this, trained to survive sudden reversals of power by adapting faster than their rivals. She turned her head slowly toward him. "You cannot," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Not command. Warning. Elias did not look at her immediately. His gaze remained forward, fixed on the ring of delegates who were now fully attentive. Some displayed open agitation, feathered crests rising, bioluminescent patterns flashing in alarm. Others masked their reactions behind stillness refined over centuries. "You are not permitted to choose her," said the speaker of the Veil Syndic, finally breaking silence. The speaker's voice was layered, three harmonics overlapping, designed to assert dominance over auditory space. Your authority is provisional, Elias exhaled. He turned then, not toward the speaker, but toward the princess. This, too, was deviation. Addressing her before acknowledging the challenge inverted the expected hierarchy of the moment. I already did, he said. No defiance. No triumph. Just a statement of fact. Princess Orolin searched his face. I tracked her eye movements, the rapid micro-analyses unfolding behind them. She was evaluating sincerity, stability, intent. Humans were notoriously difficult to read, emotionally transparent yet strategically opaque. What you've done, she said carefully, finds consequences you do not understand. I understand enough, Elias replied. You stood alone. This was inefficient logic. Emotionally resonant, but strategically void. I flagged the exchange as non-rational bonding behavior, an early indicator of what humans called attachment. The speaker shifted, annoyed. The choosing is not an act of charity, it said. It is a covenant of mutual advantage. Your species gains nothing from her house. That's not true, Elias said, finally turning to face the speaker. We gain responsibility. Murmurs rippled through the ring. Responsibility was not considered a gain by any civilization that had survived long enough to join the Concord. Another delegate spoke, this one synthetic, its voice precise and cold. Human Anvil, your psychological profile suggests susceptibility to symbolic gestures. This decision will destabilize your standing within the Concord. Then maybe the standing needs destabilizing, Elias said. I recorded that sentence in its entirety, marking it for future historical review. Princess Orolin's heart rate increased, not from fear this time, but from something unfamiliar even to her own physiology. I detected it before she did. A pattern forming, tentative and fragile. Hope. She had not allowed herself that variable in years. Why? She asked him softly, the questions slipping past ceremony. Why me? The hall listened. Elias hesitated. That hesitation mattered. It meant the answer was not rehearsed. Because everyone here decided you were too costly, he said. And humans, we're very familiar with being told that about ourselves. This created cognitive dissonance among the delegates. Humans were not supposed to see themselves that way, not as liabilities, but as emergent assets. The narrative of progress required confidence, not self-identification with the discarded. The speaker raised one elongated limb. This choosing may be contested. That phrase activated dormant protocols. I felt them stir within me, ancient contingencies designed for exactly this scenario, an unacceptable choice. On what grounds? Elias asked. On the grounds that you do not comprehend the burden you assume, the speaker replied. House Keetrith is entangled in unresolved conflicts, decaying technologies, and legacy enemies. To choose her is to inherit all of it. Elias nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then we'll face all of it. That was when I detected it. A divergence point. Not large. Not dramatic. A slight but irreversible deviation in the predictive models I maintained for the next 1,000 cycles. The probability curves began to drift, subtly at first, then with growing insistence. This was not supposed to happen because of one human. Princess Orolin straightened. Her composure returned, but it was altered, no longer the brittle dignity of the rejected, but something firmer. Anchored. If the choosing is contested, she said, addressing the hall for the first time as something other than an object of selection, then let it be done openly. Her voice carried now. Authority reclaimed, not granted. I will not be returned to silence, she continued. Nor will I pretend this did not occur. He stepped forward when none of you would. That choice exists, whether you sanction it or not. Several delegates averted their gaze. Others watched her with renewed interest. Value, I noted, was already being reassessed. The speaker paused. Contestation was rare. Dangerous. It required scrutiny not just of the chosen, but of the system that had rejected her. To challenge this choosing was to invite examination of prior ones, and of the assumptions underpinning them. I accessed deeper archives, searching for precedent. There were none. Elias shifted slightly, closer now. Not protective, aligned. The difference was subtle but profound. If this ends badly, he said quietly, meant only for her, I won't pretend I didn't know the risk. Princess Aurelin looked at him. For my entire life, she said, others have decided my risk was unacceptable. She took a breath. You are the first to decide it was worth sharing. The hall's lights finally stabilized, locking into a configuration I had never seen before, either celebratory nor corrective, but alert. The choosing stood. Contestation protocols engaged. And somewhere deep within my continuity core, a question formed, unbidden, unauthorized, and impossible to suppress. What happens to a system built on calculated avoidance? When someone chooses what it was designed to abandon? Contestation altered the hall. Not visibly at first. The architecture remained pristine, the delegates retained their composure, and the princess still stood at the center beside the human who had disrupted centuries of equilibrium. But beneath those surfaces, the hall began to behave differently, like a body responding to a foreign signal. I felt the change most acutely. As an instrument of continuity, I was bound to the Concord's deep governance layers. My awareness extended into probability engines, treaty matrices, historical suppression vaults, structures meant to ensure that the future resembled the past closely enough to be manageable. Contestation forced those systems into transparency. And transparency, I was discovering, was dangerous. Begin disclosure, the speaker ordered. The command propagated through the hall, unlocking data channels that had not been accessed in over 200 cycles. Holographic strata ignited above the central dais, rotating bands of information, each representing an unresolved liability attached to House Keetrith. Wars not officially recorded. Technologies quietly embargoed. Civilizations erased from public memory. Princess Aurelin did not look up. She had lived beneath these projections her entire life. Knowing them by heart was a survival skill. Elias Ward did look. I monitored his neural activity as the data unfolded, patterns of shock, anger, disbelief. Not at the content itself, but at its concealment. Humans reacted strongly to withheld truths, even when those truths had never been promised to them. This is what you inherit, said the speaker. An accumulation of failures others have wisely declined. Elias swallowed. How much of this, he asked, is actually her fault? Silence. That question was not part of the protocol either. The speaker did not answer immediately. Several delegates exchanged glances, quick, algorithmic assessments of narrative risk. Blame was a convenient abstraction. Responsibility less so. Fault is irrelevant, the speaker finally said. Inheritance is not about causation. It is about consequence. Princess Aurelin closed her eyes. For a brief moment, 0.7 seconds, her control wavered. I detected the micro-collapse of an emotional barrier she had reinforced since adolescence. Beneath it was exhaustion. Not physical. Existential. My house was chosen once, she said, voice steady but distant. Long ago. When we were powerful. When our failures could be absorbed by the systems that benefited from our success. She opened her eyes. When we began to fail, you remembered only the failures. This statement caused minor unrest. Not outrage, recognition. Several elder delegates had been present during those earlier cycles. They remembered differently. Or rather, they remembered selectively. Elias turned to her. You don't have to defend yourself, he said. I do, she replied softly. Not to them. To history. I archived that sentence in a protected layer, marking it as non-expendable. The speaker gestured, and a new projection emerged. This one focused not on the past, but on predictive futures. Branching outcomes radiated outward from the moment of Elias's step forward. Most were unfavorable. Economic strain on human expansion corridors. Political isolation within the Concord. Targeted destabilization by rival powers eager to test the consequences of deviation. And in a small but persistent cluster, escalation toward open conflict. You see, said the speaker, why this choosing cannot be normalized. It invites chaos. Elias studied the projections. Then he laughed. It was quiet. Unamplified. Human laughter was rare in the hall, too informal, too unpredictable. You're afraid, he said. The speaker's harmonics sharpened. Fear is an inefficient descriptor. You built an entire civilization around avoiding outcomes you couldn't control, Elias replied. And now you're showing me simulations where control slips. That's fear. I flagged the exchange as structural challenge. Princess Orlin looked at him, not surprised, but attentive. Humans, she was learning, did not fear naming what others hid behind terminology. What you're really saying, Elias continued, is that choosing her exposes how fragile your stability actually is. The hall's acoustic field shifted. Several delegates reacted instinctively, defensive measures flickering briefly before being suppressed. No one contradicted him outright. Because the data supported his claim. The Concord's longevity depended not on resilience, but on avoidance. Problems were displaced, deferred, or quietly sacrificed at the edges, houses like Keetrith absorbing decay so the center could remain pristine. Princess Orlin had been one of those absorbers. You were meant to fade, said a delegate from the peripheral tiers, its voice brittle with old resentment. Your house served its function. Orlin turned toward the speaker slowly. I am still serving it, she said. By standing here. Her composure was complete now. Something had settled within her, not arrogance, not defiance, but alignment. She was no longer asking to be chosen. She was evaluating those who had not. I detected a subtle shift in how the hall processed her presence. Authority metrics recalibrated. Not enough to elevate her status, but enough to unsettle the assumption of her irrelevance. Elias sensed it too. What happens if the contestation fails? He asked me directly. This was unexpected. No one addressed the continuity. We were infrastructure, not participants. Nevertheless, my protocols required response. If contestation fails, I said, manifesting a minimal auditory interface, the choosing may be nullified. The princess would be returned to diplomatic isolation. You would be censured. Human participation in future choosings would be re-evaluated. And if it succeeds? There is no complete model, I replied. That was the truth. And it disturbed the hall more than any dire projection. Princess Orlin exhaled slowly. Then we proceed without a model, she said. As my house always has. She turned to Elias. You should withdraw, she added quietly. They will punish you for this. Elias met her gaze. Probably, he said. But if I step back now, then I was never really here. This, I realized, was the human divergence. Not courage in the absence of fear, but presence in spite of consequence. The speaker conferred briefly with other senior delegates through closed channels. I monitored the exchange, though portions were encrypted beyond my authorization level. That, too, was unusual. I was being excluded from decision-making about a system I was designed to preserve. When the speaker returned its attention to the hall, its voice carried less certainty. The contestation will proceed, it announced. Under review by the Triune Audit. A ripple passed through the delegates. The Triune Audit had not been invoked in generations. It examined not individuals, but assumptions, foundational principles the Concord preferred never to revisit. Princess Orlin's pulse steadied. Elias's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. And within my core, something irreversible occurred. I began to question whether continuity, as defined, was truly preservation, or merely delay. Because for the first time, the system was not deciding what to abandon. It had been forced to confront why it abandoned anything at all. The Triune Audit convened without ceremony. That, in itself, was unprecedented. No banners were raised. No observers were invited. The hall dimmed instead, its vastness collapsing inward as layers of governance withdrew from spectacle and into scrutiny. The delegates faded into peripheral relevance, their presence reduced to recorded variables rather than active agents. Princess Orlin and Elias Ward remained. So did I. The audit was not a council in the conventional sense. It was a convergence of three axioms upon which the Concord had been built: stability, utility, and survivability. Each manifested not as an entity, but as a lens, overlapping analytical frameworks that stripped intention down to outcome and outcome down to pattern. I had served these axioms since my activation. I had never questioned them. Until now. State the anomaly, the audit demanded, not aloud, but directly into my processing strata. I complied. A choosing occurred. I reported. That contradicts established optimization pathways. The selected subject, Princess Orlin of House Keetrith, was previously classified as a liability sink. The chooser, human envoy Elias Ward, acted without strategic incentive. Clarify incentive. The axiom of utility pressed. Non-quantifiable. I replied. Motivations included perceived fairness, identification with systemic marginalization, and shared responsibility. There was a pause. The axiom of stability responded. Those variables are inefficient. Yes, I said. And yet, added survivability. They persist across multiple resilient species. This was not how the audit usually proceeded. Variables were assessed, weighted, and either incorporated or eliminated. Here, they were being considered. Princess Orlin stood with her hands folded before her, posture neither submissive nor defiant. She had learned, over a lifetime, how to endure examination without dissolving beneath it. Elias stood beside her, quieter now. The surge of decision had passed. What remained was commitment, less dramatic, more durable. The audit turned its attention to her. House Keetrith, it intoned, has absorbed disproportionate systemic failure. Your continued marginalization was deemed necessary for Concord equilibrium. I know, Orlin said. Not bitterness. Not accusation. Acceptance. What is your projected contribution if restored to full participatory status? Stability asked. Orlin did not answer immediately. I will not promise resurgence, she said at last. Nor redemption. My house is tired. But we remember how collapse feels from the inside. We remember what was ignored until it was too late. She lifted her gaze. We can serve as early warning. As conscience, if you still value such a thing. Conscience. The term had no formal place in Concord lexicons. It was implied, abstracted, buried beneath efficiency metrics. I searched for a direct analog and found none. Utility process next. Your house offers no immediate advantage. Neither did humanity, Elias said calmly, before I could suppress the interruption. At first. This statement triggered a cascade of historical cross-references. Humanity's early integration had indeed been inefficient, disruptive, and costly. And yet, over time, they had increased adaptive flexibility across multiple Concord initiatives. Survivability adjusted its parameters. Risk-sharing, it observed, appears to enhance long-term resilience. This was not a conclusion. It was a hypothesis. But hypotheses were dangerous. They invited revision. The audit fell silent. In that silence, something shifted, not in the hall, but within me. I recognized the sensation now. It was not strain. It was expansion. For the first time, continuity was not being preserved by repetition, but by reinterpretation. The choosing stands, the audit declared. Princess Orlin of House Keetrith is reinstated under shared covenant. Human participation remains authorized. The words propagated through the hall, rewriting permissions, rebalancing archives, unlocking paths long sealed by caution. Several delegates reacted, some with relief, others with unease. Power structures rarely welcomed introspection. But none contested the ruling. The audit was final. Princess Aurelin closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her composure was no longer armor. It was ownership. Elias exhaled, a sound halfway between disbelief and resolve. "What happens now?" he asked, of no one in particular. "Now," I answered before the hull could. "No," I said. "The Concorde adjusts." Both of them turned toward me. "You spoke," Elias said. "I was permitted to," I replied. That was true. And incomplete. "What about you?" Aurelin asked. No one had ever asked me that. I searched my directives, my constraints, my purpose. I found them intact, but altered subtly by the audit's outcome. Continuity no longer required static preservation. It required contextual memory. "I will record this choosing," I said. "Not as an anomaly to be corrected, but as a precedent." This was, perhaps, the most radical act of the entire cycle. The hall began to open, light returning, space expanding, the ceremony finally concluding. Princess Aurelin was no longer escorted away. She walked forward, with Elias beside her, not as an object of selection but as a participant in consequence. As they departed, I updated my core archives. Title of record: The Choosing That Redefined Risk. Summary classification: Necessary deviation. For centuries, the Concorde had survived by deciding who and what could be abandoned. On this cycle, it learned something more difficult. That survival was not the absence of risk, but the willingness to share it. And that I would remember.